Happy Sunday, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. So I've decided to create my budget lists for the for Tarkir, and so these are all builds that are going to be commons and uncommons, geared towards people who have a limited amount of wild cards. So for people who are beginning and who are kind of new to the game, these are strategies that are built off of cards that are competitive decks, and so I think that hopefully they're a useful tool for you. So first up here is the budget build of mono white Lifegain. Sheltered by Ghosts is a particularly strong uncommon, especially against the aggro strategies of mono red. And you've also got the Healer's Hawk and the Rune Lurker Bat and the Leonin Vanguard, which all trigger your life gain relatively easily, as well as the Hinterland Sanctifier. Whenever a creature enters, you gain 1 life. And this can make cards like your Ajani's Pridemate grow into a giant creature, and you can protect it with the Sheltered by Ghosts. And then same thing with like the Twin Blade Paladin. This one doesn't see play in the competitive deck, but I think it's a pretty decent budget option, growing similar to the Ajani's Pridemate, but then getting double strike if you do have enough life. The Cat Collector too is one that we see sometimes and not in others, that kind of helps you go wide with the Is It Prowess deck. And then we've got the Angel of Vitality, and this one's also just included for the budget build, being able to give you additional life every time that you're gaining life, and then if you have 25 or more life, then it's a larger flyer. So I threw Destroy Evil in here, just kind of, it could be like a Get Lost or something like that too. It's a decent interaction at common. And then this is my upgraded list, where this is the one that I personally use on the ladder, and you can see, like, so Caves of Kolios is definitely not something that needs to be crafted for this deck. I like it because it's a way that you can deal damage to yourself to trigger the Essence Channeler. Some people like to run Fountain Port for the same reason. We've got the Linden, the Steadfast Queen, which whenever a white creature you control attacks, you gain a life, gives you an additional life trigger. Leyline of Hope really pumps the gas in this archetype. As long as you have at least 7 more life than your starting life total, your creatures all get +2/+2. And then if you gain life, you would gain that much life +1. So it kind of gives you that angel effect, but in a card that can be in your opening hand. And then the Exemplar of Light gives you a little bit of dig. So we've seen the Knight Errant of Eos in some lists as well, just so that you are aware. But I prefer to go this route, kind of also giving you another big creature that gives you card draw while it grows. And then the rest of the core of the deck is what we already talked about. And there are no mythics. Second up is Mono Blue Tempo. And to be clear, this time around I stuck to more tried and true budget decks rather than exploring as much as I did during Aether Drift. Kind of just depends on how I'm feeling, you know. So this time, and they're presented in no particular order. I think they're all reasonably viable options. And so Mono Blue Tempo I think is a pretty good one for the budget build, because the core cards of the deck that make it work are the Edimurk Crab and the Tolarian Terror, and they're both available at common and uncommon. Do keep in mind though that actually no, we got a reprint of this in Foundations, so the DMU is rotating in, Dominaria United is rotating in the summer. So I guess I should have, next time around I'll be more mindful about making sure that the builds are rotation proof for August. And but anyway, yeah, you're just playing a whole bunch of spells that bounce your opponent's cards, Sleight of Hand to help you dig, Phantom Interference for counter spells as well as the negate, Curate helps you fill the graveyard along with the Moment of Truth, and then so you've got Dispersal into the Floodmaw and Unsummon to disrupt your opponent's plays and slow them down. And then if you can't seal it out with a Tolarian Terror and an Edimurk Crab, then you can dig in to try to outvalue them off of the card advantage, since this works relatively well to draw a ton of lands in Mono Blue. All right, and the upgrade for this one is relatively straightforward. We have two rares. We have the Haughty Djinn. This one makes all of your instances and sorcery spells you cast one less to cast, is kind of included as a long-time staple in mono blue tempo. It is a rather specific craft, though. You won't see this card in a lot of other decks, so craft with care, as always. And then Three Steps Ahead is another one that we see quite a bit of play, and is a pretty good counterspell. We see it in Jeskai or Azorius Control, Dimir Control, any decks that are interested in running counterspells. We see it in Azorius Artifacts as well, as a way to copy the Simulacrum Synthesizer. And this one also has no mythics. And I should mention just really quickly that the rare specifics for the mono white Lifegain don't see a whole lot of play in other decks outside of the Caves of Kolios. Obviously, any land fixing I highly recommend crafting early on if you are new to Magic the Gathering. So third up here is mono black discard, and I've talked about this one before, but in case you're new. I prefer the discard build over the mono black midrange build in the budget space, because the mono black midrange build has a lot of rares and mythics that are the win conditions, whereas the Bandit's Talent is the win condition and it's available at uncommon. So you're kind of building around this entire you're building around this card. So there's a ton of cards that make your opponent discard. You've got Duress, Hopeless Nightmare, Ruthless Negotiation, Momentum Breaker, Deep Cavern Bat that attacks your opponent's hand, as well as the Thoughtstalker Warlock, and then you've just got black removal, right? So you've got Cut Down, you've got Bitter Triumph, you've got Anoint with Affliction, and Go for the Throat. So attack your stuff one for one, and then win off of pinging them and drawing extra cards with the Bandit's Talent. And then if they have manlands, the Demolition Field takes care of those, all available in commons and uncommons. And if we wanted to upgrade the discard strategy, I think the Preacher of the Schism is a particularly nice one to help out against aggro, which you see a lot in Best of 1. And Preacher of the Schism also sees play in Best of 3 in Dimir midrange, sees play in some versions of Mono Black, is relatively safe craft. And then you also have the Mythic of Liliana of the Veil. And Lily, usually we see, you might only want to craft 2 of these. It depends on how in love with the deck you are, because Mythic wildcards are especially pricey, right? So I would only do these Mythics if you are really in love with the strategy. Shielded the Apocalypse is one of those cards that's rotating out in August, since it is from Dominaria. And so I guess so is Liliana of the Veil. So be careful with these specifically. And then we've got the Tiny Bones the Pickpocket, which allows us to replay the cards that our opponents are discarding. It shifts it a little bit more towards these like creature threats rather than being all in on the Bandit's Talent. But Liliana of the Veil gives you great control, being able to trigger the discard, and then can be a win condition by itself. And then Shielded the Apocalypse punishes the counter to this strategy, which is if your opponent is drawing a whole bunch of cards, then you can't answer one for one by making them discard. So Shielded the Apocalypse, then dealing 2 damage every time that they draw a card. Okay, and then I have Dimir Bounce, and I like the Dimir side of things as far as the more competitive version of this on the ladder is the Esper Pixie build, and 3 colors is just way too hard to do in a budget space because all the fixing is at rare. And so if we're going to keep this to just commons and uncommons, this time around I didn't throw all 12 tap lands in there. Obviously, anytime that you're playing in a more than a monocolor space, you will dramatically improve the archetype's win rate by crafting the non-tap lands. But I think that this will give you a relatively decent start. With the 8 is an acceptable amount, and they're available at common. But the whole point of this deck is to cycle by playing the Nowhere to Run as many times as you possibly can. It was a really great counter to the Boros Auras deck with the Sheltered by Ghosts. And Momentum Breaker and Hopeless Nightmare also allows you to attack your opponent's resources, similar to Mono Black Discard, which you can be picking up with the Fear of Isolation or bouncing with This Town Ain't Big Enough. Now, this town ain't big enough is definitely better in the build with the rares, as we'll get to. But being even able to just replay your Flood Pit's Drowner over and over, this deck has a surprising amount of tempo, even at the common and uncommon level. And lots of targets that you can bounce. I threw like a Spell Pierce and a Cut Down in here. These are really flexible. You could run whatever interaction you are feeling is good. And then Get Out is really one of the upsides to playing in Dimir as opposed to an Esper, and the double blue being difficult to cast when you're in 3 colors. So Get Out then being able to be a counter spell or being able to bounce things like this town in Fear of Isolation. And this is an upgraded list for it that you'll see Dimir bounce a little bit more commonly in best of 3, and we have seen it actually drop in popularity because it is weaker to cards like, or to strategies that are aggressive. So right now it's getting pushed out by how much is it aggro or is it prowess there is in best of 3. As you can see, the upgraded list has a full playset of all of the rare fixing. So you've got the Verge lands, so are seeing a lot of play. The Darkslick Shores, which are called the Fast lands for Dimir. The Restless Reef is the Man land, can be turned into a creature. Underground River is the Pain land, since it deals damage to you to give you blue or black. And then Soulstone Sanctuary is another Man land, and this one sees quite a bit of play. So as far as the upgrades go, I think this one is the most important one to get into your repertoire, because it does see play in mono red. It's, any typal deck. It sees play in mono black, where it gets demon synergies with the Unholy Annex. Just all around very impressive card. And then the Stormchaser's talent is also pretty common. We see it in Esper Pixie, but we also see it in Simic Tempo. We see it in the Is It Prowess deck. So there's quite a bit of interest in this card, especially because it loops with This Town Ain't Big Enough. So at 4, you can pick up the This Town Ain't Big Enough and then bounce both and replay it, and just kind of gives you some interesting inevitability to the deck. And Enduring Curiosity helps refuel. So you have a lot of flyers like your Spyglass Siren and your Fear of Isolation that draw cards relatively well with your Enduring Curiosity. This one is a little bit more specific to this archetype, again with the double blue really only seeing play in Dimir or blue-black, as opposed to the 3 color space. And then as far as the mythics go, Kaido also takes advantage of the evasive nature of the flyers, and so is a card that you see included quite commonly in the Dimir bounce archetype, as well as Dimir midrange. And Dimir midrange leans a little bit further away from bouncing and a little bit more just strictly into tempo, and is a little bit harder to achieve in the budget space. All right, here's a favorite of mine, is the Dimir Poison build, as a very nice one. It's a very nice strategy to have at uncommon and common, and I've tweaked it a little bit from the last version, as you will see. So I decreased the tap lands because I do feel like sometimes running 12 of the tap lands can be problematic, even though we do have 12 tap lands in the budget space. But the point of this deck is to negate certain strategies, right? So it's kind of all in on your opponent being weak to what it's bringing to the table. So it has some tough matchups, it has some good matchups on the ladder. It's basically a creatureless build, except for the Billow with Skull Dweller. Sometimes where you can just get in 1 or 2 times with the Skull Dweller makes it worth running. Especially because then you can start using your Proliferate once they have a poison counter. So you've also got the Vraska's Fall and the Infectious Inquiry as a way to give your opponent a poison counter, and the prologue to Phyresis. So by no means do you need to connect with the Skull Dweller, but once you do, you can start just proliferating those poison counters, and once they get to 10 poison counters, you win the game. And you've got a interaction like Annoying to drown an Ichor, the Whisper of the Dross. You've also got a little bit of the counter spells with Bring the Ending, and you've got Serum Snare to be able to bounce things and proliferate as well. So this one is dropping the Curiosity, which is the way to draw more cards in this archetype. And because of how much more we're seeing the aggro Is It Prowess builds, the draw just didn't feel as good to me. But if you feel like it's missing, you could definitely bring it back in, just so that you're aware. Yeah, and just looking at the stats, the least performing of the cards available here was the Distorted Curiosity. But I think that when you are bringing in more of the rares, it opens up more space because you don't have to run as many lands if you don't have tap lands. And part of that is just what you can get on turn one in your deck if you're running the rare fixing, which is why it's so important to craft these lands, because it dramatically improves the win rate of the archetype. So again, we've got the fast land, we've got the Undercity Sewers, which is a surveil land. This one is common in control builds where it improves the top deck to be able to surveil. And then we've got the Pain lands, and then we've got two Myrics. And Myrics is one that we see often in control builds, although it's kind of decreased in popularity a little bit with Fountain Port replacing it. It obviously has toxic synergies or poison synergies, so the Myrics works pretty well in this archetype. And yeah, so similar list, except for bringing in the Distorted Curiosities. And no mythics. Okay, so for mono red, I think that, again, focusing on commons and uncommons, we want to look at Rakdos Aggro, because this card is available at uncommon and is a way to win on turn 3. So you have the Cacophony Scamp and you have the Heartfire Hero. Both of these, if you hit them with a 2 combat tricks to get it specifically to power 7, wins even if they haven't taken any damage. Because if you don't blow up the Cacophony Scamp by its own ability, but use the fling will hit for 3 times its power. Okay, so that's kind of what this strategy is all about. You've got the Turn Inside Out and Monstrous Rage, and you can also do this with the Monastery Swiftspear. And then you've got a little bit of interaction for against the other enemy Slick Shot show-offs, or just finishing your opponent off with the with the shock directly to face. And the Bane Splitter works pretty nicely with the Cacophony Scamp and the Heartfire Hero, making it permanently increase its power, so even if it's removed by your opponent's interaction, you still have an option. And then Demonic Ruckus, I've found to be a relatively decent one, where you can plot it out and use it as part of the spells that are chaining, especially because when it's put into a graveyard, you do draw a card, and it gives something menace. So in the budget space, you can run into issues of not having as much ways to give the creature trample, and I like it more than the Might of the Meek, which can give a creature trample, but leans more heavily into mice synergies, which this deck only has the Heartfire Hero. And the upgrade for this one, so this one is my approach to Rakdos Aggro. There are different builds on the ladder that lean more heavily into the Slick Shot show-off, so that's another one to be aware of. But I like the Mice trifecta, and the Mice trifecta is Manifold Mouse, Emberheart Challenger, and Heartfire Hero. We're seeing a lot of this in mono red aggro builds, and so I think it's a relatively safe craft, although we have seen red moving a little bit away from the Mice package after the Corey Steelcutter builds in Izzet. Which, if you want to know what I'm talking about, go look at one of my best of 1, best of 3 meta reviews that I do every Monday. And so Manifold Mouse being able to grow our Heartfire Hero into a large threat every time by triggering the Valiant. It also gives an alternative way of giving a creature trample, which can be relevant. And so Double Strike with the Monstrous Rage builds your own Embercleave, which is an equipment that gives something trample and Double Strike. And then these, I think, can be largely avoided. I just want to be I just want to showcase what I've been running. I don't think you need to have the Screaming Nemesis. There are versions that would play 4 copies of the Slick Shot Show-Off instead of the Screaming Nemesis. Some play the Urabresk's Forge. I've found it to be really handy in other aggro matchups, and if you have the Screaming Nemesis, it's definitely worth including, in my opinion. And then similarly to the Rakdos Aggro, which is only called Rakdos Aggro because it has the Calisel Sword, we have Mardu Aggro, which is basically Boris Auras, but is running the Calisel Sword. But both are more budget-friendly options because you have the Calisel Sword, and it helps you win a turn sooner, which changes its matchups. But if you want to know the matchup data, again, that's something that I cover in my meta reviews. So the So this build, you're looking for a Optimistic Scavenger or Heartfire Hero to hit with the Sheltered by Ghosts, and then just Voltron, where you go tall on one thing, just throwing a whole bunch of enchantments on it, giving it the Monstrous Rage, Turn Inside Out, and then if you happen to have the Fling is less important in this one than it is in Rakdos Aggro, because it's just like icing on top. And then the Demonic Ruckus, again, is another way to just kind of like cheaply trigger the Valiant off of the Heartfire Hero. But since this one is actually a two-color strategy, you're going to want to invest in the lands, right? So definitely the Pain Land of the Battlefield Forge and the Inspiring Vantage, which is the fast land. Less so the Verge. I think the Verge, you can kind of take it or leave it. If you have it, I think it's a worthy inclusion because it's basically a Plains with upside. So if you play it like a Plains with upside, I think part of the reason why, some lists include this, some lists don't. And then similar to Mono Red, anytime that we're running the Heartfire Hero, I think it dramatically is improved by including the Mouse Trifecta. And no Mythics for this build. Alright, this time I remember to include the Selesnya Auras. It's a fan favorite. It's got a... there's some like mono black mid-range decks that are focused on creature removal that struggle with the ward, that aren't running the Nowhere to Run, really get punished by the ward 2 off of any of your Toadstool Admirer, your Tomical Honor Guard, or even your Armored Armadillo, which some lists will drop this, right? But you're doing a similar thing to the Boros Auras. You're hitting it with the Sheltered by Ghosts, you're growing the size of it with the Ethereal Armor and leaning into the enchantment synergies. And then, the upside to this build is that you get the Ward, whereas the upside to the other one is that you get the Heartfire Hero, which grows a little bit faster than these do. This one, I think, was an interesting one that we got. I think this was reprinted in Foundations. The print here is not from that, but +2/+2 and Trample and Lifelink is another way to kind of double down and beat up Mono Red. So I've liked how it's played in this archetype. And then also the Grand Entryway, I think, is a decent budget option to bring in, where you can just kind of get a little bit more enchantment synergies and the +1/+1 counter synergies. And then the upgraded list here is bringing in a bunch of fixing, because it's a actual two-color space. Sorry. And so this one, you've got the fast land of Razor Verge Thicket, you've got the Verge, and then you've got the Pain land. Again, the Verge, I think, is the least important one to craft of the fixing here, but I certainly would get the fast land and the Pain land if you want to play in a two-color space. And then the Innkeeper's Talent, I threw this one in here. It's not always included in Selesnya Auras. I've liked it because it can give you a little bit of dig and a little bit of late game strategies to draw a little bit more, and then also kind of leans further into the ward strategy. So definitely not like a necessary inclusion, but I've liked it. And then Calyx is the big payoff for being in green-white. So if you have Calyx, then copying things like your Sheltered by Ghosts is pretty awesome. Which it does so by whenever Calyx or an enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player, then you can create a copy of a non-legendary enchantment that you control. And number 9 here is Simic Tempo. This is another one that is a fan favorite. And similar to the Mono Blue, Tempo leans off of the Eddie Crab and the Tolarian Terror at uncommon. And you also have the loop of like This Town Ain't Big Enough and Into the Floodmaw and Unsummon. So some of the similarities for the Mono Blue strategy, as well as the Sleight of Hand. But then you're bringing in more graveyard synergies with Cash Grab and Seed of Hope and Bushwhack. This allows you to lower the amount of lands that you're running, and Up the Beanstalk does as well, because it allows you to draw off of your 5 costed cards. And if you upgrade the lands, you get to go even lower on the land count. I've seen lists go as low as 16. I think this one is at 17. Yeah, and that's where I've found it, where I like it to be. So you've got the fast lands and you've got the Pain land, and then this one is running the Surveil land because it has the graveyard synergies, and doesn't have as much room to run the Verge. But then you wouldn't have any basics to grab with your Bushwhack. And then you've got the Storm Chaser's Talent, and that one again pairs with this town ain't big enough to give you the loop. And then Analyze the Pollen allows you to grab lands and fill your graveyard, or Tutor for your Eddie Merc Crab if you have some in your graveyard. It's also no mythics. And number 10 here is Golgari Selfmill. This one was an archetype that was, the shell of it was brought to the World Championship back in last fall. And it works relatively well in the budget space, being synergizing off of Up the Beanstalk, similar to the Simic tempo build, but instead using payoffs like Overwhelming Remorse, Gravestalker, Marauder, and Swarm, or Huskburster Swarm, which all get cheaper off of the cards that you have in your graveyard. Now, beginners are always scared of Selfmill, especially in draft when you see your bomb go down into the graveyard. It's good to get used to Selfmill. It's not a bad thing. If you ever want to talk about the math, I'll be happy to showcase how it doesn't really actually change anything unless you're losing to mill. If you lose the mill, then the Selfmill hurts, but that's really the mindset you've got to get yourself into. But anyway, you're running Rubberbill Maverick, Molt Tender, Cenote Scout, the Gnawing Vermin, Blanchwood Prowler. All you target yourself and put the cards into your graveyard to get those synergies. And then that allows you to continue to draw and answer 1-for-1 with Up the Beanstalk. The upgraded list is same core strategy, bringing in the Golgari fixing. So we've got the Verge land, we've got the Pain lands, we've got the Fast land, and then we also have the Surveil land and 4 copies of it because the graveyard is very important in this strategy. And again, you can kind of see the forests have been replaced with the Verge land. And then we've got the Souls of the Lost, and this one synergizing well with filling your graveyard full of creatures specifically. And the Mythic, there is the Overlord of the Bailmerk, and this one allows us to fill our graveyard but then bring things back. And Harvester of Misery works pretty well too, either as a sweeper against Izzet Prowess, but also at just discarding this to give something -2/-2 gives you a creature in the yard while being removal. And last but not least, and I think this one is actually one of the weaker versions of the Golgari Poison, of the budget builds, but Golgari Poison does work in the budget space as well. Leaning off of the black side of the Dimir Poison strategy, with the black removal and the proliferation off of Whisper of the Dross and Drown and Ichor. But it's a little bit more creature-centric. So the synergy of this deck and why it's more creature-centric is because of the Death Touch off of Billow's Skulldweller works amazingly well with giving, or with Finn the Thangbearer, which if a creature with Death Touch deals combat damage to a player, they get 2 poison counters, and it stacks. So you can go turn 1 Billow's Skulldweller into turn 2 Finn the Thangbearer and hit your opponent for 3 poison counters on turn 1. And then from there, you hopefully can seal out the game. This one's got Necrogen Rot Priest, which if a creature with Toxic deals combat damage to a player, they get an additional poison counter. So you can just stack them on top of each other. And then because it's more of a creature-centric build, we can play the Blightbelly Rat. And same with the Infectious Bite. Being able to use the Bite spell in green that gives your opponents a poison counter. And then we still have the Infectious Inquiry as a way to give them poison counters directly, and the Necrogen Communion is another one for the creatures, since there's a higher amount of creatures. If you enchant something like your Skulldweller and hit it with the Necrogen Communion, it also hits for 3 Toxic on turn 1, and then if it dies, it comes back. So you can put it on something like the Blightbelly Rat and guarantee that you're going to get at least the 2 things proliferate. And so similar strategy, win through poison synergies. And last but not least is the upgrade to this. And again, this one, not a tier 1 deck, but still kind of fun. So you've got the Golgari fixing, very important to craft, Fast lands, Pain lands, Mirrex, just like Dimir Poison, and then we've got the Seed Core. And since you're more creature-centric, the Seed Core becomes a little bit more important. Do keep this in mind, though, that this is something that is only seeing play right now in this archetype. We used to see it being played in Selesnya Poison, which was a little bit more creature forward, but this tends to be the more common creature forward strategy that we bump into, and it's definitely not super common. But Venerated Rot Priest is really nice in green, making it so that as they target your creatures, they get poison counters. And then Bloated Contaminator also is a good one in green. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, it proliferates, and it has Trample. And then you have enough Phyrexians in this one for it to be a kind of typal deck where you can play the Cavern of Souls to prevent your opponents from countering your stuff. Once upon a time, we saw Cavern of Souls being a very important thing prior to rotation last year, because Azorius control was everywhere. And control in large part has kind of taken a little bit of a it's not as mainstream this time around, but we're starting to see signs of things kind of shifting back in that direction. So I wouldn't be surprised if Cavern of Souls becomes a little bit more relevant in the near future, but it's just a hunch. So thanks as always to listening to my ramblings. I hope they find you well. I hope the decks help you enjoy Magic the Gathering even when you're on a budget. I play an obscene amount of Magic, and you either pay with money or you pay with time. But if you pay with time, like I have, and play the game daily for multiple years, you can collect every single card in the game and play with any deck that you want, which, if you love Magic, is a pretty good payoff. So I hope this helps you accomplish that goal, if that is your goal. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave a comment below. In fact, actually, it really helps me if you put a comment down below, even just saying good job or thank you very much. I appreciate that. And yeah, I do this out of the joy of the game. Magic the Gathering is my favorite game, and I've played it for almost 30 years. So I will continue to do this, regardless of whether or not you are a YouTube member or not. But if you want to help support me, you can become a YouTube member. I appreciate those who have. And you can always drop by on Twitch. I live stream there. Come hang out and listen to music and talk to me. Or you can join my Discord and kind of geek out about Magic over there. And yeah, if you have any questions about like why you can't play any of these decks because you're stuck on Alchemy, reach out and I'll be happy to help you. And with that, take care, everybody, and I will see you all tomorrow for my final Best of 1, Best of 3 meta review for Tarkir. Take care.